Dan Jones. Welcome to Interchange. Lots of interesting things to talk about today. The National Boy Scouts organization drops its longtime ban on gay men serving as Boy Scout leaders. We'll also talk about the Milwaukee Art Museum actually rushing to put on display a picture of the Pope made out of 17,000 condoms. And we'll talk about any bumps in the road you might expect now that the state has okayed a plan to build a big new arena for the Milwaukee Bucks. Before we get going, let me introduce my guest. Of course, you know Kevin Fischer, who spent many years in town as a broadcast journalist and many years after that as a legislative aide in Madison. And Denise Callaway, also a very respected former broadcast journalist who is now a communications and public relations professional. Rick Horowitz will be along with commentary at the end of the show. All right, let's talk first about the decision by the National Boy Scout organization to drop its longtime ban on gay men as Boy Scout leaders. Church organizations which have Boy Scout troops will not be required to follow suit if they don't want to. Will this be the end of Boy Scouts as we know it, or is it just the right thing to do, Kevin, in this day and age?
Well, I don't think it's the right thing to do in this day and age. There are some who think, well, that's just the way life is now. That's just the way the world is. No, a lot of people don't see it that way. So we knew this was coming. 2 years ago, the Boy Scouts announced at that time that they were going to include homosexuality within their ranks and that they were going to disavow the oath that Boy Scouts have taken forever. And so now we see this inclusion of gay men, gay Scout leaders. What they have done, what the Boy Scouts have done, is they have put political correctness above, they have made it a higher priority than children's safety. Keep in mind that the head of the Boy Scouts is Robert Gates. When he was Secretary of Defense, he not only lobbied for, he oversaw the repeal of the don't ask, don't tell policy in the military. And what happened? You had a tremendous spike, a 33% increase in the number of male-on-male assaults. Now, does any rational, reasonable thinking, sane individual think that the same thing isn't going to happen in the Boy Scouts? And it's a real danger. This isn't freaking out. There's the real possibility of, you know, gay boys flirting with straight boys. And what's next? The Girl Scouts have decided to take in boys that pretend to be girls. What's next for the Boy Scouts? Are they going to take on sexually confused girls and let them join the Boy Scouts? So no, the Boy Scouts organization, it's not going to go away, but it's not going to be the same as it was.
If you were a parent, if you were a parent of a 12, 13-year-old kid, and you found out that the Boy Scout troop that your son wanted to join had a gay leader, would that concern you at all?
No, because the whole idea that somehow men who are gay are pedophiles and interested in boys is absolutely false. What the Boy Scouts did was what, quite frankly, they should have done years ago. There is no evidence that gay men have an interest, a sexual interest in young boys. That just has never been proven, and it's not the case. And quite frankly, I think when we take a look at the way this country has come to accept and understand that individuals who may happen to have a sexual orientation that's different still have gifts and talents that they are able to share and to improve in the community. The Boy Scouts did the absolutely right thing to do this. They've given churches who don't want to do this the ability to continue to discriminate against individuals who happen to be gay, who want to be Scout leaders. But they've opened up the door for those folks who are progressive and who understand that there are folks who have talents, and those talents transcend what their sexual orientation is, that they need to have the ability to do this. As a society, I think that over the past 10, 15 years, certainly, we've become much more understanding that individuals who are gay are not people who put our children at risk. They are not. They simply just happen to have a different sexual orientation than other folks do. They're still very capable of doing other things in life, and they do. They need to have the ability to be able to contribute to our society, and we shouldn't have these false barriers in place that are based on no facts at all.
Is this a generational thing? I was talking to somebody about this today, and they said, you know, it's only people in our generation that would be concerned that a gay person would be a Boy Scout leader. She said, if you talk to people in college now, they couldn't care less if somebody's gay, if they're a gay teacher, or a gay Boy Scout leader, a gay whatever. They don't care.
I think there's some truth to that, but there's also some truth to the fact that there are probably some 20 or 30-year-old parents who are going to think twice now about enlisting their boys when they become of a certain age into the Boy Scouts, because I think Denise Callaway needs to read more studies. There are studies that show that these gay men, you know, they
Scientific studies do not show that, Kevin.
Well,
they don't.
Well, I think you should read some of these studies on gays as they relate to sexual pedophiles, and it's a real danger. And I really think that there are parents who are very concerned about this, about sending their children out on overnight camping trips when they fear something could happen, and it will happen. I think it's a certainty that it will happen.
It's interesting that you're saying that, because that is almost making the assumption or ignoring the fact that during the many years, all these years, that the Boy Scouts have had this no gay scout leader policy, there have been children who've been assaulted. They've been assaulted by people who are pedophiles who are heterosexual. Mm-hmm. So it's not as if you can suddenly say...
This opens the door even further.
No, it doesn't. It does not. Gay men are not interested in small boys. They are not. And I think, quite frankly, there are some parents, there are certainly young parents who I know, who have not been interested in having their kids be in the Boy Scouts because they feel it does discriminate against a group of individuals based on sexual orientation, based upon fear, based upon misinformation, based in some cases upon homophobia. That is really what we have seen. The other thing, quite frankly, Kevin, is if you take a look at the Boy Scouts, because the country has shifted and begun to really understand that people who have a different sexual orientation are not a danger to us.
This isn't an anti-gay. This isn't an anti-gay sentiment.
What has happened is the Boy Scouts over the past 10 years, the Boy Scouts have continually lost funding because people see that their actions prohibiting gays from joining, they really see it as a discriminatory policy. There are some organizations, including organizations here in Milwaukee, that will not fund the Boy Scouts because of this discriminatory practice. So it's not totally about political correctness.
It is.
It is also about the fact that the Boy Scouts were losing tens of millions of dollars each year in contributions because organizations would not
100 years of morals and values and virtues and policies because they caved. They caved to the homo-fascist left and a political agenda. That's what this is all about.
I think what they've done is evolved, like the rest of the country has.
Like the president.
Like the rest of the, well, not just the president, the rest of the country has evolved. I know certainly my views are very different today than they were 10 or 15 years ago on people who are LGBT. And that is because of information and exposure and a desire to understand. And I think that's what other people in this community have done, country have done. As we discover, we have relatives who are LGBT, and we don't see those relatives as being any different. We suddenly don't notice that, you know, Uncle Joe, who we didn't realize was gay, is gay. We're now suddenly afraid to leave alone with our children because there is no risk, there is no concern.
All right. Next topic. The Milwaukee Art Museum had planned to display a picture of Pope Benedict made out of 17,000 condoms this coming fall. That decision created a huge controversy. It created such a controversy that the Art Museum decided, well, we're going to put this thing on display early, and they did just that this week. Is this exactly what a big art museum should do, or is it incredibly disrespectful?
Well, we talked about this a few weeks ago, and I just find it reprehensible what the Art Museum did and the way they did it. It's their museum, and somebody bought this trash and decided to donate it, and they can display it. But they should have gotten a better read of what the community thought about this work. They should have had meetings and discussions, especially with concerned Catholic parties. But no, apparently it's open hunting season on Christianity all the time. there would have been people protesting if, say, this artwork would have been a photo or a painting of, say, Hitler wearing a yarmulke. Okay? If you would have desecrated or denigrated any other religion or faith, there would have been hell to pay. But because it's against Catholics and it's against Christians, hey, it's okay, because that's the way it is in society today, especially in the world of art and entertainment and movies. We can bash and bash and bash Christians all the time, and it's okay. It's all right. And I don't find, okay, art is subjective. I don't think this is art. I think it's trash. I think it's garbage. I think it's junk. And I wouldn't pay one nickel. I wouldn't cross the street to see this exhibit.
Would you feel the same way that, yeah, it's okay for them to display this if it was a picture of President Obama made out of 17,000 condoms?
Well, we've seen some pretty bad pictures of President Obama depicting him in ways that certainly are not complimentary, and you don't have to pay to go to an art museum to see them. We've seen them at various protests, particularly about Tea Party protests around the country. But I think we have to remember kind of the purpose that art has in our lives, particularly in modern society. It really is to beautify and to inform, to enhance our lives. But art also has a bit of controversy in the work that it does. It virtually always has. When you go back to the great masters, when you take a look at the Impressionists, people thought the Impressionists were crazy when they were painting the way they were. So art is also designed to really engender discussion, sometimes about very controversial and timely issues in our community. So I do think that while this is offensive to some people, I absolutely understand that. I also think it has engendered discussion in this community about AIDS and the AIDS epidemic, particularly in Africa, that we have not heard about in a long time.
So why drag the Pope into it?
But if that is because of some of the comments that the Pope made about the use of condoms and that he made about AIDS. So that is why that
you ridicule and desecrate and
I don't
denigrate?
think you're ridiculing him.
I think that's the purpose of this artist.
Well, I think the purpose of this artist is to draw attention to the comments that were made and to the fact that there is still a significant AIDS crisis in Africa. And the comments of Pope Benedict were that he did not believe that that was the case, that he did not believe that condoms were something that were really going to help stop the spread of AIDS. When in fact, condoms, particularly in Africa, are one of the main ways that healthcare workers have been working to try to stop the spread of this disease that has wiped out families and that has wiped out villages.
Well, I think that's the wrong way to drive your point home. I think there can be a backlash. If that's your goal, if that's your altruistic mission, I think you run the risk of failing big time because it is so offensive to so many people, and it is disrespectful to a faith, to a religion led by a pope that has done so many good things, has engaged in so many missions, not just in Africa, but all around the world. Catholics have donated their time and efforts and money, and this is the thanks you get by denigrating the sacred leader.
If the artist made a picture depicting Mohammed in some embarrassing situation to draw attention to some of the Muslim anti-female views, would the art museum ever display a picture like that?
No.
Well, I don't think that's true.
And Denise Callaway would be up in arms.
I don't think that's true. I think, again, art serves a variety of purposes in our lives. And if one of these purposes, just as the purpose here, was to begin to re-engage people in a discussion about AIDS in Africa, if the purpose of it was to somehow say we need to take a look at these tactics that are being taken involving women, I would say that's a discussion that we need to have. I think one of the things that art holds is that nothing is sacred. Would the museum ever
display such a picture?
I think it would.
Or would they be afraid?
I think it would. And I will say this. I think that one of the things that the Milwaukee Art Museum had a decision to make, it could have backed off and said, whoa, we're hearing all this, so we're going to let art be censored. because that's really what would have happened if they would have decided they weren't going to show this portrait.
Instead, they rushed to open the door and say, come on in, take a look.
But he also said, the head of the art museum also said he has never had as many requests to see something as he had this piece of work.
Okay, all right, fine. But if art is to engage people in a discussion, how about real photographs or even paintings of people in Africa that have been affected by AIDS? Wouldn't that be a more powerful image? Wouldn't that stir a public debate instead of this doesn't beautify the Pope. I'm sorry, you used the word beautify. Instead of lampooning him.
No, I didn't say it beautified the Pope.
No, you said that art is one of the missions of art is to beautify. Yeah,
right.
But I think that would be more effective and again more powerful if you wanted to show images of the effects AIDS has had on people living in Africa. I would actually want to see that as opposed to this absolute garbage. To me, that's what it is.
You know, I think, Kevin, one of the problems is, and I think we're kind of illustrating it, quite frankly, here. When was the last time, prior to the discussion about this particular piece of artwork, that we had a discussion on this show about the impact of AIDS in Africa? And it's an impact that continues to be a real threat to the economic health of that continent, as well as the health of thousands, hundreds of thousands
I'd love
of
to
individuals.
have that discussion, but I wouldn't out of the box say, you know what we should do about AIDS in Africa? Let's draw a painting of the Pope and put 17,000 condoms on it. That'd be the last thing I think of. In fact, I would never even dream of using that as a vehicle to start a discussion about the peril of AIDS in Africa.
All right, next topic. So the plan to appropriate hundreds of millions of dollars in public monies to help build a new arena for the Milwaukee Bucks finally was approved by the legislature and will be signed soon by the governor. But it still has to get the okay from city and county officials. Do you expect any bumps in the road, or will this all be smooth sailing?
Well, it's Milwaukee. Of course there are going to be bumps in the road. You have the Common Council and you have the county board who certainly want to be able to weigh in on this. At the end of the day, though, I expect that we will have this arena built, that they're going to sign off on the package that was put together. You know, interestingly enough, if we take a look at all the things that were talked about to finance this arena, the initial proposal that Governor Walker suggested, the $250 million really coming from taxes on the salaries of athletes and others, may have been the best way to do this, but that's not what we have right now. So I think we're at a point where we have hopefully exhausted every possible opportunity that can exist. I anticipate the county board's going to have some questions, perhaps not as many questions about its role in the arena as it will in the efforts by the county executive to sell 10 acres of land for $1 in the Park East corridor. But that's probably a topic for another show. I do think there's going to be a lot of discussion. I think there's going to be some wailing and gnashing of teeth. At the end of the day, they're going to go ahead and approve it because you don't want to be the body that caused us to lose the Bucks.
Yeah, you don't want to blow this up. I mean, especially after all the heavy lifting has been done by the parties that have been negotiating for the last, whatever, several months, even years.
Does this make Walker look good? Can he say, here's another thing I got done?
Well, it depends on your perspective. You save the Bucks, and if you do nothing, that's far worse, all right? And I'm not a big fan of the deal. I'm glad we saved the Bucks. I think the deal isn't all that terrific. And I've stated why many times on the show. I think there's way too much public money involved and not enough private money. But you save the team. I mean, there's only, what, 30 in the world?
Right.
And if they leave, now we're really in trouble economically. But there are others who say that the governor gave too much away. I've heard, and I think there's some merit to this, that the billionaire owners came in and they dictated. They said, you're going to do it our way, and this is what we want, and you give it to us. And there wasn't much pushback. There wasn't much pushback. And if there would have been, okay, if Plan A doesn't work in these kinds of deals, there's always a Plan B.
Right, but
and I think there could have been a much better deal.
If Joel was here, he said at the beginning, yeah, this will go through because the billionaires always get what they want.
Well, that's why they're billionaires.
Right?
You know, the thing that happened, let's talk about who's getting what they want. The folks who are getting what they want, it's the NBA. Because the NBA wanted a new arena for this town. And it said, if you're going to...
They didn't care because there's Seattle and Las Vegas out there.
They did care because they said, if you're going to keep this franchise, this is what you have to do. Then you had people who came forward before there was any discussion about where any other money is going to come from, saying this is what we'll pony up. So, you know, I do think that we're in a situation where we don't want to lose a major league franchise. I mean, that's what little towns do. That's not what towns that are interested in growing and being productive and being seen as places that people find as attractive places to live do. You know, for goodness sakes, we lost the Braves. How long did it take for us to get the Brewers?
Well, it was about 6 or 7 years, but
you can't assume that you're going to be able, if you lose this team, to get another team to come in. It's not going to happen.
You just don't go down the street and buy another one. But
would Milwaukee be less of a great city if it didn't have?
Well, there are two.
If it didn't have the Bucks?
That too depends on your perspective. You know, you have a crowd, and I've talked to them, okay? And I've emailed with them that, you know, we'll be just fine. If they leave town, we're not just going to blow up. We're not going to disappear. We can survive without them. Oh really? All that lost revenue, all that lost taxes, you're really, really worse off with them leaving. So you can't blow it now. All the heavy lifting has been done. I think it swims through the Common Council. Fine colors, I think. I really do. But the county is where it could get, you know, kind of feisty because you've got this rift between the county executive and the supervisors, and part of the deal that was signed, that will be signed by the governor, has the county not involved at all in trying to secure some of the debts that people owe, and there are some county supervisors who want the county to be involved in that role. So there might be some rumbling, but I don't think there'll be anything that'll stand in the way of this deal being eventually done.
And we talked about the economic part of it, but the reality of it is the Bucks, particularly under these new owners, have become extremely engaged in the community and are doing much more to give back to the community, to become involved, to really be a part of the community. So
let's see if that continues. I think it will, but let's see.
I have every confidence it will, but I also think it's not just a matter of what the financial impact of it is. It is the impact that they have in terms of lending their voice, lending their concern to issues that are important in this community. And I suppose we would be fine, however we want to define that, if we did not have a Major League basketball team. But I really think it says so much about this community when you can point to the fact that you have the Bucks and that you have the Brewers. You seem like a big league town when you've got big league sports.
Now, another complaint is that, and I've heard this, I'm sure you have as well. Well, we have, you know, all the money that's been spent on this. We have crime and we have joblessness, all right, and we have school issues. That all that money could help. True, but you're always going to have those problems. You have to have a strong economy. A new Bucks Arena, any ancillary development helps build the economy, which can then help address some of those issues. Without that economy, you're never going to be able to find solutions to those serious problems.
More jobs, less crime.
We move on. If you've been anywhere near a TV or a computer for the past week or two, you've seen the story of Milwaukee's Mystery Lion. It's not just grabbed attention here in town, but all across the country, too. And because an epic saga certainly deserves a little epic verse, Rick Horowitz has kindly volunteered to be Wisconsin's new poet laureate. Rick.
'Twas on a steamy summer night that people heard the news, and panic gripped the city like a plague. A critter from a distant place was wandering our streets, though the first reports were tentative and vague. The creature had 4 legs, a tail, a firm yet silky stride. It moved among the trees and through the grass. Yet no one had a picture or an unobstructed view. Was local news intrigued? You bet you're... Slip away, lion-like animal, slip away. That's how the headlines put it, because no one knew for sure. It could be, well, it might be, well, who knows? We need more information. We need a closer look. In the meantime, though, a city on its toes. It's certainly a lion or a cougar or a lynx, a coyote or a bobcat or a deer. Walked all the way from way up north, or maybe way out west, or maybe it was Amtrak brought it here. Slip away, lion-like animal, slip away. And then there was a sighting. What was rumor now was real. A snippet of a video, no less. We saw it move from left to right. We saw it disappear. A beastie out for fun or in distress? They called in the authorities, the cameras and the scopes. They'd never seen the like around these parts. They took up their positions, hunkered down and armored up with cages, guns, and tranquilizer darts. Slip away, lion-like animal, slip away. The hours passed, the days went by, they waited and they watched as nervous neighbors fired the random shot. The bulldog will recover, just his luck to be outdoors. But everywhere they looked, the cat was not. Some say the lion never was. Some say it's still around. Some listen for on summer nights. And some believe it's been and gone, a sudden change of plans. Minnesota with a dentist in its sights. Fire away, lion-like animal, fire away.
Well, thanks, Rick, and thank you so very much for watching. That's all the time we have today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.